Chapter 16, Part 2. The Major faced his enemy hand to hand, at last, savagely kicking out at the creature's arm. The spear that had killed so many flew from its grip and clattered to the rocks below. Before it could quite recover, its golden eyes blinking bewilderedly, Schaefer followed with a karate kick to the chest, hurling the creature face forward onto the ground, its broad back exposed to the veteran commando. Instantly, Schaefer was standing over the alien, his bow drawn and poised, the blood from his shoulder dripping onto the creature's livid skin. Slowly, the alien rolled onto its back, revealing its ghastly face. Its eyes were bleached nearly white with shock from the loss of blood. Its body rippled out of control as it tried desperately to disappear into its dark surroundings. The old chameleon's escape. But now, in its weakened state, it couldn't bring off the transformation. The Major's curiosity exploded. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, glaring down, his own eyes blazing deep in their sockets. He was monstrous in his own way. Incomprehensible sounds choked and coughed from the alien's gullet, till at last it began to form words. At first they crackled, as if they were coming through a weak radio signal. Then they got clearer and stronger with each syllable, until the alien did a perfect imitation of Schaefer's voice. "Who the hell are you?" It mimicked slowly, methodically, almost in sing-song. Then it collapsed for a moment, as if it were totally spent of energy. But with a single concentrated thrust, it lashed out an arm, activating the razor-sharp spurs at its wrists. An instant later, it coiled a leg and kicked upward with renewed and brutal strength, its terrible heel spur ripping into Schaefer's thigh, hurling him backwards so that he crashed into a shallow ditch of water. Floundering desperately, the Major grabbed for his bow, which had bounced away in the fall. He found it just as the creature rose to its feet, inhaling deeply and hungrily, gaining strength again with every breath. Schaefer saw the alien retrieve and raise its weapon again. Then, with one instinctive movement, his shoulder throbbing with pain, he drew the arrow back to its tip and let it fly. With a deadly thud, it penetrated deeply into the alien's neck. Another blood-curdling scream of rage echoed through the trees as the enemy clutched its throat, dropping its spear once more. A second later, it bounded away down the rocks, hissing and rumbling with pain and loss and anger. Schaefer scrambled out of the water and pursued, following the bowl of the canyon above the river as he picked up a fresh trail of the faintly luminous amber. The Major's shoulder had stopped bleeding, leaving a caked clot of thickened blood along the gash, but his thigh was streaming blood profusely, and with every step a hot stab of pain shot through his leg. Yet he pushed onward, half hobbling, climbing the slope by swinging the weight to his good leg. The trail was clear to follow, because the alien was too weak to sail through the treetops or to clone itself into a creature of flight, bird or fly or wisp of air. It stumbled along through the tangled forest, leaving a swathe of trampled grass, broken twigs, and chunks of dirt thrown up by its dragging spurs. Spent and enraged, groaning with fury, the alien arrived at the edge of the clearing where its ship waited. It was bleeding severely now, and had virtually lost all of its camouflage abilities. Its skin had turned a pale, sickly green, and slithered along its body like a snake struggling to shed itself. With trembling three-pronged hands, it grasped the shaft of the arrow protruding from its neck, and pulled it out with a roar of pain. A spurt of grey choke from deep in its guts erupted and spilled from its mouth and down its leathery chin. Schaefer was relentless in pursuit, obsessed with ending the killer's rampage. He was working his way through a narrow passageway in a grove of rubber trees when he almost walked into a vast spider web that measured 4 feet across, blocking the path. Instinctively, he moved to sweep it aside with his machete when he noticed an odd quality about the way it caught the moon's dim light. Examining more closely, he realized that the network of membranes wasn't the silken thread of an insect at all, but hair-fine wire. A trap. He jumped back at the realization, then picked up a hefty branch, hurled it into the center of the trap, and watched the mechanism spring into action. There was a metallic snap, followed by a high-pitched whine as the wood impacted on metal. The branch, 5 inches around, was violently torn apart, and pieces of wood flew in opposite directions, whipping into the jungle. Schaefer wiped his brow with relief, then pushed ahead, stepping gingerly over the coils of wire lying inert on the ground. He didn't even stop to wonder if this was part of the guerrillas or the aliens' arsenal. The death snares were so all-encompassing now that they seemed to be set by the violent earth itself. A few minutes later, he arrived close enough to the alien ship to see the surreal blue glow filtering through the trees. Then, in the clearing ahead, he spied the alien itself, staggering towards the light. Schaefer was about to close the distance and have it out at last when he was stopped in his tracks by a hideous sight that came crashing down on his senses, obliterating everything else. At one end of the clearing, translucent human skins had been stretched over wooden frames, the attached scalps rippling lightly in the breeze. Flayed bodies, some lying on the open ground, were scattered about the area, while others hung from the trees in much the way Davis and his men were found. There must have been at least 30 bodies, guerrillas as well as commandos. "Even the fucking Nazis didn't do this," Schaefer muttered in outrage, sick at the pit of his stomach like one of the men who'd liberated Buchenwald. But he had no time to sink into the horror, so he forced his mind to be tempted only by the rage, and used that rage to drive him forward. He turned again to his target, and saw that the alien was passing through the shimmering glow of the force field. Cautiously, Schaefer walked closer, and saw the egg-shaped outline of the ship. The creature was walking with great difficulty up the ramp towards the open door of the spacecraft. It still looked awesome, as its silhouette was bathed in the pulsing blue glow of the ship. But to Schaefer, in his fury, the creature seemed more frightened than frightening. Weakened though he was by his wounds and by exhaustion, Schaefer staggered forward and looked up in time to see the alien wave a hand across a light beam. The ship instantly responded with a turbine whine which built slowly and steadily in volume and pitch. The predator turned and gazed out over the thick jungle that still hid Schaefer, as if it sensed the commando's presence in the shadows. Then it turned back and entered the force field. The door began to slowly close, as if it sensed its captain was about to enter and there was no time to spare. Schaefer felt a sudden throb of panic as he saw the enemy about to retreat to safety. He darted into the clearing and spotted the alien's weapon at the foot of the ramp. The creature had either dropped it in the delirium of its wounds, or perhaps it felt no need for the power anymore. It was on its way home now. There would be other weapons for other planets. Schaefer grabbed up the odd instrument, perplexed. How to operate it? Was it keyed to something in the creature itself, so that only the alien could fire it? The Major squeezed the handle and felt resistance. Again he tried with the last ounce of his strength and screamed a bellow of rage as he crushed down on the handle. Suddenly, a blue-white light shot out at the end, and the spear was activated. Schaefer raised it, sensing its power and function by sheer feel, warrior to warrior. He leveled the thing at that disappearing back of the alien just as the door was closing behind it. Schaefer shouted triumphantly and hurled it. Flaring with deadly energy, the weapon shot off like a meteor up the laser ramp, accelerating through the door and into the spacecraft. It lodged in the back of the creature's neck, and in that instant the door froze half open. The alien's head exploded, but slowly, in a kind of slow motion, almost as if the gravity within the craft was different from the Earth's. A geyser of amber-orange blood shot out, then pale green tissue, as the brain burst. Then the spearhead continued out through the alien's throat, burying itself in the side of the ship, sending bolts of plasma energy arcing through the force field. Schaefer fell forward onto the ground, half in a swoon as he stared at the incredible sight. The whirring sound from the ship grew to a feverishly high, ear-splitting pitch, and the whole craft began to tremble and quiver as if it too would explode. But by now Schaefer could no longer tell if he was conscious or unconscious. He wasn't sure anymore if he was still in one piece himself. Two attack helicopters' blades slapped the thick jungle air as they powered their way through the canyon, racing along at tree-top height. The first carried a VIP crew. Its leader, General Phillips, turned to his most important passenger, the rebel, Ana Gonsalves. "Does this look familiar?" he demanded, pointing to the snaking river below. She peered down at the dimly lit tangle of jungle and rushing water and the bramble-covered ridge. Then she saw the huge mahogany log lying beached against the shore, the log on which she and Schaefer and Ramirez had crossed the churning rapids. "Yes, yes," she said, nodding enthusiastically. "Right down there." And she pointed to the rocky ridge. "That's where I saw him last." Phillips turned to the pilot. "Follow that ridge," he ordered. As the pilot tried to oblige, maneuvering quickly in the canyon updrafts, his instrument panel went wild, the gauges spinning, digital readouts out of control. The pilot lurched forward over the steering lever, desperately fighting to regain their equilibrium. At the same moment the chopper went out of control, the alien's ship had reached a loud, deafening whine, and the ground in the clearing around it began to quake. Schaefer, realizing even in his half-stupor that the thing was going to explode, ignored his knifing pains and ran desperately for the jungle, seeking cover. He sprinted to the edge of the clearing and dived over the embankment just as a blinding purple flash blew the ship to pieces. Fragments of the rare interplanetary metals shot hundreds of feet into the sky. A half-mile away, the choppers were enveloped in the flash of intense light and momentarily helpless. The aftershock pulsed through the sky like a sonic boom, knocking the choppers haywire as they floundered 200 feet in the air. Below, concentric waves of energy pulsed outward from the center of the blast, as if a miniature star were being born. Then, just at the moment when they would have dropped like birds with broken wings to the trees below, the chopper's mechanisms returned to normal function as the sonic waves subsided. The pilots were just able to pull up in time to prevent crashdown. "Holy Mother of Jesus!" Phillips' pilot exclaimed. The general was shaken and totally bewildered by the bomb blast, but he had to stay in charge. He knew something extraordinary had just happened, and that it was beyond the soldiering techniques of the guerrillas or even his own beloved army. "Orbit right," he ordered. "Check out ground zero." The pilot leveled the craft and headed across the treetops towards the source of the blast, now rolling with smoke as several trees went up like fireballs. Meanwhile, Schaefer cautiously lifted his head from the ground where he'd flattened himself in the dirt for protection. He stared at the devastation with a curious dispassion. The entire area was deadened. Every leaf, every tree, every living thing within 50 feet of the ship was black and charred, stripped down to a pulp of smouldering wood and naked dirt. And everything was coated with a fine sifting of white ash, like fallout after a nuclear blast. At the center site of the ship itself, magnesium flares still burned with exotic colors, like some weird carnival at the end of the world. Schaefer rose up from his desperation and stared, hollow-eyed. Behind him, the sound of choppers grew louder as the two craft flared over the trees, but the Major didn't appear to notice. The crews gaped at the devastation as they approached, slowly, their eyes struggling to penetrate the dense white smoke. As one descended, the other hovered 100 feet above. As the first drew closer to the ground, its prop wash created a whirling storm of white dust. As they hovered about 20 feet over the annihilated landscape and some of the dust blew off, they beheld a figure materialize from the raging smoke and ash. A naked body covered head to toe in mud, blood, and soot. It was Schaefer, but looking for all the world as if he were the alien. As the chopper hovered over the blast site where the spacecraft had once stood pristine, the visored and helmeted men with weapons poised looked suspiciously at Schaefer. To the lone naked warrior gazing up at the choppers like a caveman, the soldiers looked as much like aliens to him as he to them. Which was the truer soldier? Who could say any more? All the rules had changed, though only the naked man knew how much. The door gunner swung his M60 into firing position, pointing it directly at Schaefer. He racked the bolt, loading a round. The other three soldiers watched silently, tensed, frightened. Schaefer didn't look human at all. They didn't know who he was. But Anna, crouching beside the door gunner, staring transfixed at the strange creature before her, narrowed her eyes and tilted her head. There was something about his gait, about the lift of his broad shoulders, that looked familiar. As more of the ash settled like snow, Schaefer's image grew clearer. He looked up dazed and raised a hand, like a lost man in space making contact with members of an alien race for the first time. Men were looking at men, but neither side seemed to know anymore what a man was. It was a hopeless standoff. The chopper hovered nearer to the ground now, but still as if reluctant to land. More helmeted and visored men crowded at the door. More weapons levelled at Schaefer. Suddenly, Anna's eyes went wide with recognition. She held up her own hand, like a mirror image of the waving man below, and shouted, "No! No! Don't shoot!" And she shoved the gunner's rifle aside, just as he squeezed the trigger, so the weapon shot off harmlessly into the smoking trees. "What is it?" Phillips demanded, grabbing the woman's hand as if he feared she was sending signals. "It's your man," Anna said excitedly, pointing down at the Major. "It's him!" Phillips squinted and looked hard. "Holy shit! So it is! Hold your fire!" he bellowed. Anna shoved her way through the huddle of men and leaped from the craft, which was hovering about 5 feet above the ground. She landed on her knees on the ruined ground below, scrambled to her feet, and charged towards Schaefer screaming, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're alive!" she hollered, then threw her head up to the sky. "Thank you, Father! He's alive!" And she rushed over to the dazed, shocked commando, tottering there in the war-torn clearing and barely able to stand. She threw her arms around him. "Oh, thank God, you're alive!" she sobbed, impulsively covering his bloody chest with kisses. Schaefer looked down at her through glazed eyes, then his mouth turned up with a faint smile of recognition. He let her take his hand and lead him over to the chopper, which now hugged the ground, its blades slowly whirling. The soldiers all stood back from the door as Anna scrambled in and reached for the Major. He gripped her hand and, grunting with his wounds, slung himself up and in. For a moment there, as he was in movement, he showed a trace of the old football hero, victorious at game's end and ready to be borne from the stadium on the shoulders of his teammates. Moments later, they were airborne, heading at high speed across the trackless jungle, the rotors thumping like heavy machine gun fire. Schaefer was seated on a bench in the cargo hold beside Anna, who still clutched his hand and wept softly, though she was smiling the whole time. A green army blanket was thrown about the Major's shoulders, mud and blood still streaked all over him. His entire body seemed laced with deep cuts. The medic, hunched before him with an open field kit, syringe and bandages, turned to Phillips. "Looks like he's been through hell. I can't believe he's still alive. What the fuck went on down there?" "If it hadn't been for her, he'd be dead now," Phillips retorted, glancing down at Anna, confused in his heart because he knew she was a rebel. "That story she told us, I still can't believe it." The general looked directly into Anna's eyes, as if to check once more about her incredible explanation. She returned a defiant look, even through her tears, that said she had been through hell herself, that all of it was real. Then she looked to Schaefer, as if there was comfort at least in sharing the secret, as if feeling a bond with the commander would prove to herself that she wasn't crazy. And somehow she knew they would also share more, now that they were no longer enemies, and the nightmare was safely past. Schaefer looked back at her and smiled wearily. His eyes were a little clearer now, and his breathing had calmed. Then he turned to look out at the bright gold of the rising sun as the two choppers headed off for the far horizon. For a moment, he seemed to stare deep into the distant heavens, but what he saw didn't register in his hooded eyes. He had had his private war, and the winning of it, and whatever peace it left behind, were things he would never speak. It was a kind of homage to the men he'd lost. As he stared at the sky, hints of pink and gold splashed across the Contamana border, announcing the coming of day.